Hey everybody, it's ShadowStar here, and it is time for me to go over my ranking of Series 3 of Modern Doctor Who. So, Series 3 is a rather contained season, and a rather tricky run to rank. I feel like after the first two, everything's still pretty damn good, and honestly, I had a hard time ranking these ones. I kept backflipping and changing positions, but eventually I think I settled on a ranking. But let's get the obvious ones out the way. Starting bottom of the barrel in 11th position, it's 42. It's just such a dry episode. It's just an episode. That's all you can say about it. It's like there's nothing special about it. It's almost like if you took everything that was memorable and special about the Impossible Planet and the Satan Pit and took that away. So you get the most run-of-the-mill Base Under Siege episode with a completely forgettable side cast. And what do you get? A boring episode with a forgettable side cast. And that's about it. The only highlight scene is that scene where Martha's trapped and floating towards the sun and she says, "Oh, they'll miss me." But then you realize that is almost word for word a rip-off of a better scene from Gridlock. So its only redeeming scene isn't even original. And even they knew that. Oops, nice going, Chibnall. But yeah, there's nothing memorable about 42. There's nothing. It's just boring episode. It's like if you took the most cliche episode aspects and tried to write an episode. Well, that's what you get. Anyway, moving on to 10th position, we have the Lazarus Experiment. Another one where, first off, I rarely make a fuss about the CGI in Doctor Who, but even I can admit, what were they thinking with this monster? It's a mess. I mean, God, it's just weird. But anyway, getting to the point, this episode, compared to pretty much everything else above it, it's got nothing special. It's got standard family drama with Martha's family. It's got a villain who you just don't find engaging, and it feels like we just keep repeating the ending. It's like we think it's over, and then he's done, and then it's like, oh wait, nope, he's not just dead yet. Now he's got to chase us to the church. It's like it feels like we were padding for time with that scene. He was dead, then he wasn't, then he's dead again. Come on, guys, we're wasting time here. We're just stalling for time. And other than that, it's just, there's nothing memorable about the villain. There's nothing memorable about his motives. It's just, there was no highlights to the episode, and that's the problem. I don't overly hate the episode. Like, even with 42, I don't hate 42. It doesn't piss me off. It's just these first two episodes, nothing about them makes me happy. Now we've got the next one is Shakespeare Code. Like I said, pretty much everything from here on is still a good episode. Shakespeare Code just ended up being a little lower than I expected, but it's still good. It's still good. So the downsides is we do drag on and keep bringing up Rose, and that's one downside of Series 9 is Rose just gets brought up a little bit too much. Like, I get it, she was a companion for 2 seasons, but she gets brought up a lot, unlike Classic Who, where the pattern is just move on pretty much 2 episodes later. But, it had some good scenes. The side characters, well, mainly Shakespeare, was an enjoyable character. There is one cringy line when we're saving the day, which hasn't really aged well, but oh well. But, it's Martha's first proper adventure, which, I think they captured the magic of her first adventure in those early scenes very well, which I love. You've always got to have a good first adventure, and this one does a good job of being the first adventure. Moving on, we have Daleks in Manhattan and Evolution of the Daleks. I know some people don't like this Dalek story. I actually do. I get it, some people might think the pigs are silly, but other than that, I think it's a really enjoyable episode. All the side cast are enjoyable characters. It's a great Dalek story that, unlike, it's not big like some of the finales, it manages to just kind of be a Dalek story, which is great. It manages to just be a Dalek story with enjoyable side characters, and because there's only 4 of the Daleks, you manage to pay more attention to those Daleks. You get an interesting story. It feels almost like a classic story where the Daleks are doing some kind of experiment, which is always great, rather than just the run-of-the-mill Daleks are here, they're going to kill people story. So you get, an interesting take on the Daleks, and the acting is pretty good for the person who plays Dalek Sec. Well, more accurately, the guy who plays Dalek Sec once he becomes human. That's tremendous acting. And then Martha, once again, is a highlight in this episode because she's already had a few adventures, so now she really starts to get into the role of time traveling. So, a good story for Martha, an interesting take on the Daleks. I think people overlook this one a bit too much, and I don't know why. It's a great episode with a lot of nice scenes. Sure, you get the great musical number, you get the Doctor climbing the top of the building, you get the Dalek and Doctor confrontation, which is always great. There's a lot of good moments in this episode. Moving on, we've got Smith and Jones. It's interesting to see the episode this low, but like I said, all the episodes are good. It's a good episode. It's a good first episode for Martha, and it's the first time we've had a new companion in the modern series since Rose. So it's fun to kind of start afresh, which is always the joy of a new companion. It's almost more of a clean slate. It's almost starting with a new companion is more of a clean slate than starting with a new Doctor, and this is the proof of it. We get to introduce the Jadoon, which is a brand new villain who keeps coming back. We get to introduce Martha, and she shows off how well she is as a companion. And honestly, because I feel like we get into the action a lot more faster than, say, the first episode with Rose, which is great. The first episode with Rose was a bit slow. Here, this feels like a great first story, and also feels like a good story that is able to pick up the pace fairly quickly with an enjoyable villain, enjoyable side villains, and just, it's a great first episode with Martha. There's not much else to say. And then the ending, and obviously you've got the ending where she joins the TARDIS, which, Martha's first scene in the TARDIS is a great scene as well. A lot of people overlook that one. Like, you've got Rose's first scene in the TARDIS, which is more quiet. Then you've got other unique takes later on, but I feel like Martha is just a nice classic version of the first time you get into the TARDIS, which is great. Now, in sixth position, this is tough to say that this is sixth position, but I'm giving it to the finale, Last of the Time Lords. The ending is very much Deus Ex Machina. Like, it's just, okay, words, and the Doctor was somehow able to magically tune himself in with the satellites, which magically makes him grow up again, and magically makes him glowing and powerful. It's like, okay, yeah. Russell T Davies does love his Deus Ex Machina, which is a shame. But there's a lot of good scenes. The Doctor confronting the Master on that hillside is a good scene. Martha alone against the world is a good scene. So those are all good scenes, but compared to the previous two that had preceded it, because the Doctor's in chains, the Jack is in chains, you feel like it's just more the here's Martha story, which is great. It's the Martha story, although Martha does spend a lot of time hyping on about how much she loves the Doctor, and we know how much I don't care for those scenes, so I can there's still a lot of great scenes, there's still a lot of fun moments, especially near the end, but I feel like it's a bit all over the place, and between Martha hyping on the Doctor and the Deus Ex Machina, there's a reason it couldn't beat out the two episodes that preceded it. Moving on, we have Gridlock, an episode which I think people overlook a lot. There's a lot of good scenes. First off, the music when the Doctor is describing Gallifrey at the very end is very nice. It's just a nice moment where we sit down and the Doctor gets to be serious with Martha, and it's a scene where Martha respects the Doctor a lot more. The previous episodes were Martha's first adventure, but this feels more like Martha's first adventure, even though it's not. In the sense that she gets trapped and she's alone, and like I said, they basically ripped off all the good scenes from Gridlock and used it in 42, except here that they've done it first. The side characters are all enjoyable, which is great. You get an interesting take on New Earth, and for an episode where we spend most of the time in the same set, it's a great episode. Then you get the tragic death of the face of Bo, which, even though it's a character we've barely interacted with, the way we see the grief on the Doctor makes it feel more powerful, even though we've barely seen the face of Bo. And it's an episode, because of scenes like that, Martha seems to connect and respect the Doctor way more in those scenes. And so I think a lot of people overlook a lot of highlight scenes in this episode and just think of that as the episode where people are trapped in cars. But Yeah, it's a great episode, and they even bring back a classic villain with the Macra, even though the Macra aren't really villainous, so you could almost say there's no real villain of this episode. So it was a good idea to go back to the future one last time. So, moving on to fourth position, we're getting into the heavy hitters with Utopia. And oh boy, I could not make up my mind whether Utopia or the next episode would go in fourth position. I kept flip-flopping on which episode is better, because there's quite a few good scenes. The scenes where Martha is talking with Jack when we first meet Jack is great. The scenes where Jack and the Doctor are having a long conversation about what happened to him and what has been going on with him in the past and all that stuff. The reveal of the Master is great. It's one of those things where episodes love to do the coincidental thing where everything happens at the same time, even though it doesn't necessarily have to. Like, they're preparing for the rocket launch at the exact same time that the Professor is starting to focus on the fob watch and become the Master. It doesn't have to coincidentally happen then, but it does, and obviously that makes a more climactic scene. And, the fact that this is the first time we've seen the Master in so long is great. And it is great that Big Finish decided to give Derek Jacobi more time as a Master, because he plays a good Master for only, 2 minutes. So, yeah, this episode has a lot of highlight points, and it's interesting to think about the fact that try watching this on your first watch through before the Master reveal, and it's just a story about Jack coming back and these people in the future. But then we remember it more as the Master story, even though the Master reveal takes so long to happen, and if it's your first watch through, you don't really think about that stuff. Anyway, top 3 position, and I'm giving it to The Sound of Drums, the second last episode. Way better than the finale, and I had a tough time, but it's probably better than Utopia, I finally realized. First off, I have to give highlights to the scene where the Doctor and Master are calling each other. That's great. It's the first proper confrontation these two get to have. They'd interacted with each other a tiny bit, but this is the first time they get to have a long conversation. It's also kind of memorable. It reminds me of the first actual Master story where John Pertwee is on the phone to Roger Delgado. And this time they get to have another phone conversation, and they do it so well. They get to have a confrontation, they talk about what their plan is, they talk about the Time War. You get to see a bit of empathy between the two of them when they talk about the Time War. It's one of the most very well done conversations. It's so well done, in fact, that it was one of the rare times where in TV they have a phone conversation where they're actually on the phone. They called each other and played this phone conversation for real. It's just a really good scene. And then, obviously, the other really good scene is when Jack, Martha, and the Doctor are all chilling in that warehouse, and the Doctor starts to explain who the Master is, and Gallifrey, and you get this really perfectly done music piece as he explains it, and then, we really get to sit down and talk about the plot. That's a really well done scene, and that's probably why I had to push this one slightly over the top. And then everything obviously all kicks off with the Master at the very end, and it gets crazy, but it's a really good kind of crazy where everything's happening. Like I said, I always say, setting up a crazy cliffhanger is way easier than paying it off, and they do a well done job of just making this a crazy, crazy ending, but also managing to be slow and have those scenes where we get to sit down and have a lot of good scenes about the Master and Gallifrey and so on. Anyway, second last position, Human Nature and Family of Blood. I think it's a really good story that managed to stand up on its own. I love the fact the first episode, the first half, is almost a period piece, in a sense of nothing alien is happening except a few things in the background and Martha, but because the Doctor's human, you could just, the first episode almost entirely just feels like a small little piece on its own, and I really love that. You really get a little bit of a mystery, you're not sure what's going on, you get to develop all these characters. It's a perfectly well done two-parter that uses its time so well, and it manages to, and once again, you got to give credit to the fact of, David Tennant playing this other character where You can still tell he's using the same voice as the Doctor, but he takes a lot of the quirky inflections down so he sounds more mundane, and he does it so well. Like those few scenes where he switches back to the Doctor for a second, you instantly can tell it's the Doctor. It's just, that's how you do perfect acting, where instantly you can tell who he's doing. But seriously, they play these characters so well, and you feel like they're a real character even though they're not a real character, which is so good. Yeah, the villains, even the villains are great. Like, all the actors they picked for the villains are great, which is great because obviously they've got to play both a real character, then eventually they have to play the villain. It's just it starts as a nice quiet period piece where you really enjoy it. You get to sit down and just enjoy a quiet episode. And then obviously the second episode is the crazy episode, but there's lots of good moments, like the speech where Latimer talks about the Doctor and Martha talks about the Doctor, and there's lots of good scenes. And obviously there's the ending because it's 1913 and we foreshadow World War One, which is the year after it. And obviously there's the ending where we see there's just so many. It's an episode where it's got crazy speeches, it's got the fury of the 10th Doctor, but it's also just, it feels like a quiet episode, a really nice quiet episode that makes you feel for the past. And that's the best way I can describe it. Now let's move on to the best episode of the season, the one we all saw coming. It's Blink. Call it an overrated episode, but how could it not be at the top of the list? I mean, come on. When Moffat wrote this, he thought, oh, it's the Dr. Light episode. I'm throwing myself under the bus and I'll take it. And yet it turns out to be one of the most iconic episodes. And yet the Doctor's barely in it. And yet it's got some of our most memorable moments. The introduction to the Weeping Angels. It's got a tremendous, well-done time loop, which Moffat excels at. It's got memorable characters, way more memorable than the ones from Love and Monsters. The fact that these characters are so memorable that you forget you're watching a Dr. Light episode. You really do. Like, these characters feel like they're straight out of the Moffat era. It's one of the most iconic, memorable episodes, and yet it's a Dr. Light episode. That's the whole climactic scene where we're talking with the videotape is well done. When you think about the director, that's got to be one of the most well-written things, where you've got to write it like a conversation, but also have it be a one-way thing. It's just got some of the most iconic lines. I mean, what more to say over it? We've all seen Blink. We've all seen the internet explode talking about it. It's the Weeping, and obviously, not only is it the first Weeping Angel episode, but it's the best Weeping Angel episode. Like, all future Weeping Angel episodes don't hold a candle to how they're done in this episode. I love the fact that, in this episode they say they're quantum locked. No one knows what a Weeping Angel looks like. And that's what I loved about it. No one knows what they look like. We never see them truly moving. And I love that. This episode manages to be so huge, and such a small, tiny little episode manages to be so huge. The fact that they put that little quota on the ending, the time loop, it's just, I'm probably repeating myself at this point, but we all know it. It's crazy how this one little episode just exploded. And I don't know how much of an impact this had on the fact that Moffat became showrunner, but I feel like this one had a huge impact on the fact that he later became a showrunner, even though he's managed to write some incredible stuff in the past. But to do what he thought was going to be a bad episode because no one likes the Doctor episodes, and managed to make it one of the most memorable episodes, even though the Doctor's barely in it at all. It's so well written. Every scene is crucial. Every character is memorable. It is quintessential Moffat at his best. And that's the best way I can describe it. I could go on and on, but I think we all know what everyone thinks about Blink. Anyway, that was Series 3, and I found Series 3 to be the toughest to rank, because there were so many episodes where, like, all of them, except maybe Lazarus and 42, are so good. Series 3 gets overlooked. Series 4 is perfection. Series 1 is the first one. Series 2, I had such a hard time ranking these episodes. I really, truly did. It's like, wow, every one I could think of so many good moments for, and I had to keep swapping the positions. Series 3 was tough. But now, thinking about it, if Series 2 was this tough, I'm going to have such a tough time. I'm going to be ranking Series 4 next. And there's no such thing as a bad Series 4 episode. How am I going to do it? It's not going to be easy. It's just, well, we'll figure it out. I haven't even started getting through Season 4 just as I'm recording this, but it's going to be difficult, but it's going to be fun. And yeah, I'll see you next time when I rank Season 4's episodes. See you next time, guys.